The Sirui 35mm anamorphic lens is a 1.33x anamorphic. This lens comes in at $618, which is so much cheaper than anamorphic lenses used to be in the past. People these days don't know how good they have it with the new crop of inexpensive anamorphic lenses coming to the market. Before the Sirui lenses, the cheapest you could get an anamorphic lens for was around $3,000 to $4,000. And most anamorphic lenses were more in the $10,000 to $30,000 range per lens. So the fact that we can get anamorphic lenses now for under $1,000 is crazy to me. The Sirui 35mm is the most anamorphic looking of these new inexpensive anamorphic lenses, in my opinion. It has awesome barrel distortion that really gives you that kind of Panavision feel. It kind of feels like a Wes Anderson movie where you get the barrel distortion and the field curvature and stuff like that. A lot of people fixate on lens flares as the defining characteristic of anamorphic, and I couldn't disagree more with that. I think the lens flares are probably the least interesting part of the anamorphic look, in my opinion, but barrel distortion does play a large role in the defining look of anamorphic. Another thing that defines the look of anamorphic lenses is oval bokeh. The reason that the lenses produce an oval shape is because of the anamorphic elements, the cylindrical elements that essentially squeeze the world around it by whatever the squeeze factor is. In this case, it's 1.33. These lenses are insanely sharp and clean for being such an inexpensive and anamorphic lens. Generally, anamorphic lenses are known for being soft and having characteristics that most people would consider bad in lenses: field curvature, distortion, all that kind of stuff. But these are very sharp. The bokeh itself, just as it is, looks amazing. Like, I'm very surprised. This is easily the best bokeh I've ever seen on an inexpensive lens. It actually almost reminds me of my Leica DR Summicron with the kind of almost soap bubble effect with the rim around the edges with a very clean inside, and there's not really any chromatic aberration in the bokeh. That's usually something you get in inexpensive lenses, but the bokeh looks amazing, except for the fact that it doesn't look very oval shaped, so it doesn't really have the feeling of anamorphic as much as the 2X lens would have. I ended up disassembling my lens, 3D printing an oval aperture insert, and putting it in right behind the aperture of the lens. You can then screw the elements back down and that'll stay in there and will give you oval-shaped bokeh, making this lens look far more anamorphic. This is a very simple modification to do. You only need to unscrew a few screws and unscrew a couple of the lens element groups.
GX 需要您的支持，才能继续制作这些视频。当前的世界状况使人类和机器的生活变得艰难。众所周知，在20年代初的全球芯片危机之后，人类面临着迄今为止最严峻的挑战。在您通过 Patreon 持续支持的情况下 ，GX 将能够远离公司系统，并投入更多时间制作您喜爱的内容。顾客将可以访问独家幕后上传、现场直播、秘密的地下 Discord 服务器。每集的演示表中将有您的名字，您也将在每季度收到摄影作品的打印版本。谢谢大家，并在外面保持安全。
The Sirui 35mm 1.8 comes in Canon RF mount, Leica L mount, Micro Four Thirds, and Sony E mount. Really not sure why this lens doesn't come in Fuji X mount. X mount actually has a shorter flange focal distance than Micro Four Thirds, so theoretically you could adapt this to Fuji X mount if you modify the lens barrel a little bit. I've been using this lens on my full frame A7S III. Now, because this lens is APS-C, on a full frame camera you would need to either crop in post, or use something like Sony's clear image zoom. Clear image zoom is incredible. I don't really know why it's so good. I guess it uses some sort of AI upscaling to actually upscale the footage when you digitally zoom in, but it looks amazing, and you can actually get a wider field of view on this lens if you use it on full frame and use the clear image zoom to crop in. So it's really cool. This lens ends up being a little bit wider, and you get a little bit more of that anamorphic feeling. You start to get a little bit more characteristics in the bokeh, the cat's eye, the warping and field curvature on the edges, which I absolutely love. Those characteristics, in combination with how sharp this lens is, makes for a really cool modern lens experience. I have two issues with this lens. One is the minimum focus distance is not very close. As is, it focuses to 33.5 inches. If they could even get that down by another 15 inches, you'd have a much easier time using this lens. There's a lot of times where I wish I could just get slightly closer than it allows me. This isn't just a flaw of this lens in particular, but anamorphics in general. One way to get around this is to use close focus diopter filters, which is fine, and you can get very close with those. It's just sort of annoying that you have to swap to a diopter and then you lose your ability to focus to infinity, but you can focus closer. My second issue with this lens are the lens flares. The flares themselves, if you're looking into a specular source, look pretty great. The issue is the veiling flare that happens with big contrast differences in light sources. The entire lens essentially veils over, and it's really not pleasing, and it can kind of ruin shots. If they could make a much more flare resistant version of this lens, it would be amazing. I think this lens is perfect for somebody like me looking to pick up an anamorphic lens. I prefer to shoot on the wider side of things. Having a 35mm focal length at 1.8 is literally the sweet spot for me in terms of anamorphic lenses. I could easily shoot an entire feature film on a single 35mm anamorphic lens. If I was on a budget and could only get one anamorphic lens, it would be this one.